You were one of the people who just couldn't make it last Thursday. It's my great pleasure to introduce Father Simon Gain. He's OP, Dominican order. He's based at Blackfriars and he's the regent of Studium. In other words, he's charge of the academic program. He's going to talk on one of the things that is very dear to Dominicans, thankfully, which is about preaching. And I'm as keen as you are to know what he's got to say. So welcome.
In some ways it's easier, I think, to say what Dominicans are than to say what spirituality is. But I'm going to take spirituality to be a part of how we make our way to God during our lifetimes in this world, in the here and now. So I'm thinking of spirituality as part of what we do, part of what happens to us as we make our way back to God, from whom we came. God is our source. We come from him in the sense that he created us, but he's also our goal. We're making our way towards him. Well, that's spirituality in the sense that I'm going to take it. Spirituality isn't the whole of how we make our way to God. If I were to give a complete account as a Catholic of that, I'd have to speak about Christ, the scriptures, the church, the sacraments, morality, and a whole lot of things. But spirituality is one part of this web. And Dominican spirituality is the particular take that Dominicans have on how we, or they, Dominicans, make their way to God. There are various elements of Dominican life that inform this particular spirituality. But one very obvious element is the fact that we are the order of preachers. So preaching is at the centre of how we Dominicans make our return to God. You have to remember that an order of preachers was a great novelty when St. Dominic founded the order in around 1216. The preachers of the church were, of course, bishops, though they might also get someone to fill in for them. But medieval bishops, they were busy men. So preaching wasn't something that you might hear a lot of, but certainly not from your parish priest. So a whole order of religious engaged in preaching wasn't something you'd expect, but it was certainly something that was needed. St. Dominic experienced this need when he passed through the south of France in around 1203. He was on his way from the Cathedral of Osma in Spain, where he was a canon, to somewhere up Scandinavia way. He was accompanying his busy medieval bishop, a man named Diego, on a diplomatic mission to secure the hand of a royal princess for their king. What Diego and Dominic encountered on their way in France as they're making their way through was the heresy normally known as Albigensianism or Catharism. And on their way back to Spain, they tried to do something about this heresy. That is, they preached. So I ought to say something about the opinions that provoked Dominic into preaching, because this has marked the content of Dominican preaching and spirituality ever since. Cathars didn't believe that God had created the material universe we see around us, and of which at any rate our bodies are a part. They didn't accept that Genesis 1 was inspired scripture. In fact, they thought that a great deal of the Old Testament was not Holy Scripture. They certainly accepted that Jesus Christ prayed to his Father, and that this Father was the creator of all that was good. What they did not believe was that this material world was part of that good God's creation. To put it simply, they thought that matter was evil and that it was all created by an evil God, while another good God had created the good spiritual side of reality. The evil God had then entrapped within the evil physical material world fragmentary spiritual beings, that is us, human beings. We are seen as these spiritual sparks in need of liberation from this evil world, in need of being released from these alien physical bodies of foul matter, whether male or female, to become once again our true spiritual male selves in a purely spiritual heaven with no resurrection of any disgusting body. Physical reproduction was a bad thing because it would only mean imprisoning another spirit in matter. Sex was bad because it imprisoned. What human spirits needed was freedom. However, even death won't necessarily release us, because we shall simply be reincarnated over and over again, unless the Cathar religion releases us. This religion had been given by an angel sent by God to teach us this religion. This angel was Jesus. So Jesus is a spiritual liberator, but is neither God nor is he flesh. So no incarnation, no redeeming death on the cross, no real resurrection, and no sacraments, especially no Eucharist. The physical, being evil, could not in any way transmit the spiritual, so no sacraments. And there was no human Christ to be present under the signs of bread and wine anyway, and no sacrificial death to recall in any Eucharist. Liberation instead came through the means of some kind of baptism in the Spirit taught by this angel Christ, where people were guaranteed liberation if they led the strictest sinless life. Only such sinless ministers could give you this baptism. It's very different from Catholic sacramental theology, where Christ, and not the moral uprightness of the minister, guaranteed a sacrament's validity. And since receiving this Cathar baptism committed you to quite a rigorous life, most people would arrange not to receive it until they were dying. Now, Dominican preaching and spirituality have always had certain features in their content because of the nature of Dominic's encounter with these Albigensians. And that's the first time he really saw the need, the dire need, for Christian preaching. Dominican preaching today, whether through sermons or books or on the internet or whatever, is just as likely to have the same kind of themes as Dominic would have preached in the 13th century. So, bearing in mind the kind of system the Cathars put forward, what I've just explained, preaching in the Dominican tradition goes roughly like this. There is only one God who is good, omnipotent, and radically distinct from everything else that is. All else that is created by this God is good. All of it is good. Human flesh, matter, the physical order, including sexual reproduction, is part of this very good creation. Central then to our salvation from our sin is the incarnation, the taking flesh of the second person of the Trinity in human physical flesh, together with the reality of his death and the reality of the resurrection of the body. In the transmission of this redemption to our basically good though damaged humanity, Christ makes use of physical signs in the sacraments. Their validity depends on his power, and of especial importance is the Eucharist, where the body of Christ is really present and a genuine redeeming death is sacramentally made present. All this is leading ultimately to our own bodily resurrection, a liberation of matter rather than a liberation from matter. A clue of the importance of all this to Dominic can be seen in how he prayed. when people watched him praying, they witnessed a very physical spirituality, a prayer that belonged to the body as well as to the soul. People saw him bowing, people saw him kneeling, genuflecting, prostrating himself, and so on. His belief in the goodness of the body involved his body in his path to God and in his path to the resurrection, just as he was preaching the goodness of all creation. That, however, is just to talk about the content of our preaching. I think that there's something to be said for the occasion of the beginning of our preaching also having an impact on subsequent Dominican spirituality. I think that it has given a certain form or style that characterizes our preaching as Dominican, in addition to the characteristic content I've just told you about. Now, what I mean is this, I'll explain a bit more. Our preaching arose in the first place as a counter to the false ideas of the Albigensians. What got the order going was the need for truth in the face of falsehood. One of the order's mottos is truth, veritas in Latin. And for us, preaching is the communication of truth. Our spirituality is a dedication to the truth. Now, characteristically, we don't see ourselves as preaching in order to stir up people's devotion or anything like that, though that does come into it. Principally, we see preaching as the communication of truth, the truth that sets people free from the damage that can be done by falsehood. And the motivation to do this arose out of Dominic's compassion. Dominic's compassion can be illustrated from a couple of stories. Back when he was a student in his young days, he sold his books when there was a famine, and he gave the money to the poor for food. On a later occasion, he heard that some people had been captured as slaves by Moorish pirates, and he wanted to sell himself into slavery to get these poor people released. It was this same compassion that motivated Dominic to preach. And if there's such a thing as Dominican spirituality, then it's pretty much to do with the connection between compassion and truth. That it's a work of mercy to share the truth with people who are enslaved by falsehood. One of the remarkable things about the Dominican order was that it was founded for others, for the salvation of souls. At the time, most people would have seen the purpose of entering a religious order as the salvation of your own soul. The world, for all its goodness, was a dangerous place, and entering the cloister was a way to secure your own salvation. Again, being a Dominican is all about being useful to the salvation of other people. And that was the whole point of an order of preachers. That's our spirituality. A Dominican of the first generation of preachers had a dream in which he saw members of different monastic orders crossing a river quite easily and securely by way of a bridge. The Dominican, however, was having to swim the river, which had something of a rough current, and tied to him with a rope, by a rope, was a whole boatload of people whom he had to pull to the opposite bank. Well, that's Dominican spirituality. So the order wasn't founded solely to refute Albigensianism, if kind of a negative way of looking at it. Even before they got involved in the preaching in the south of France, Dominic and his bishop had noted that there were tribes, like the Tartars, still unconverted to Christianity. They had actually wanted to go and convert them, but but the Pope told them that they already had their commitments back home. But as a result of their preaching in the south of France and a subsequent visit to Rome, Dominic came to conceive of a universal order of preachers. By 1215, there was a permanent community of preachers, as what today in the Catholic Church we might call a diocesan institute, functioning under Dominic's direction in the Diocese of Toulouse, with the support of Bishop Fulk, the local bishop. But from 1216 onwards, things were transformed into a universal order with a universal mission of communicating truth. Some of this might have come from the Pope, whom Dominic met in Rome. The Pope, of course, having a universal concern as the pastor for the whole Catholic Church. But then there was also a vision had by Dominic in St. Peter's Church, a vision of Peter and Paul, which seems to have led him to scattering the small number of preaching brothers in different directions, to Italy, to Spain, and during his lifetime, even to England, and here to Oxford. Eventually, the brothers were formed into a number of different provinces, of which England is one province. This shows how Dominican preaching as such has a positive character, the communication of God's truth in potentially all situations, not just opposition to some local heresy in the south of France. And with this comes mobility. Whereas religious orders had normally been about a lifelong commitment to living in one particular Christian community, like a Benedictine monastery of monks, or commitment to care of souls in one particular place, like the Augustinian canons, of which Dominic had been a member at Osma. Well, being a Dominican would involve the possibility of being moved around from place to place. When we're moved, the superior of our province, called the provincial, well, he takes into account the needs of the province and the ways in which you can be useful, quote, in Christ's service. So we're moved wherever we're considered useful in the work of preaching to others. And so, as the mercy of God is universal, so the compassion of a Dominican that leads to preaching has to be potentially universal, because we can be sent to preach anywhere. And this mobility is something else that's at the heart of our spirituality. Of course, if the communication of truth is useful anywhere, you might also wonder whether truth can be found anywhere. This is another aspect of the universality of the Dominican understanding of truth. We find it ourselves, truth, in dialogue with other people. And this too affects how we operate as preachers and teachers. When we read about Dominic preaching among the Albigensians, we're not to imagine he just spoke to them from some kind of outdoor pulpit, although he may have done that some of the time. Preaching was something far more interactive, something more like a debate, something far more two-way. It might actually involve representatives of both sides putting their case, and the audience would be led, hopefully, to make their own minds up. On one occasion, actually, they couldn't make their minds up, and the two sides had to throw their books into the fire, with Dominic's books leaping out of the fire, showing on whose side the truth was. But what arises out of this approach for Dominicans is more than that we want to have arguments in our preaching to show why we're right. This kind of engagement with the views of others leads us to want to look for what truth we can find in their arguments, not just to dismiss them, but to have a kind of empathy for where they're coming from and see where our common ground is, so that we can see where we really disagree and why we disagree. Again, this is a characteristic feature of Dominican spirituality, to try to be useful to others in part by trying to see their point of view. Dominican compassion is not about straightforward and easy refutation of the other person, but Dominican universality of truth has to be ready to engage with truth wherever it's found. So Dominicans took very easily to some of the academic methods of their age, as found in medieval universities like Oxford, where they very quickly arrived in search of vocations and, of course, in search of truth. In a medieval disputation, a question is proposed, and various opinions are given one way or the other on the question, and then the professor sorts it out and answers all the points that have been put, or all those anyway that would have gone against his own opinion. And this is something seized on by Dominicans, really to understand the objections to your own position, to try to identify the truth that is there within those objections, to identify what you can share in common with your neighbour, and then answer the objection in the truest way possible. Then in the later Baroque period, another form of disputation emerges, where two friars start off taking different positions on a question, and then gradually through courteous argument, seeing where you really agree and really disagree, and to look at the different ways in which you might be using the same words, you move persuasively to something more of a consensus. Occasionally we've performed these things in public, but as a kind of a wrestling match rather than a boxing match, if you see what I mean, because you know who's going to win. But if you get a chance ever to see one of those disputations, you should. But my point is that this spirit of inquiry is an important aspect of how a Dominican will seek to communicate the gospel and share the truth of the gospel with others. This attention to the other has a still broader effect on the character of our life and so a broader effect on the character of our preaching. Well, something of this can be seen in Dominic's first encounter with an Albigensian. It was with a sympathiser rather than with one of the so-called perfect who'd already received their baptism. Anyway, this Albigensian was an innkeeper. He was the keeper of the inn in which Dominic stayed on his first journey through France. Dominic discovered that their host was a Cathar, and he spent the whole night sitting up with him, arguing and discussing and persuading him that the physical world was good and that it was the creation of a good God. So Dominic really engaged at close quarters with what this man did and what the man said. Now, when some Cistercian abbots had set up a Catholic preaching to the Albigensians, they'd come along from some remote monastery with their retinue, they'd set up, they'd preached, and then off they went, and their mission was a failure. Well, for Dominic, one really had to know the people that one was speaking to. One thing that Dominic learned was that people were impressed by the strict manner of life of the Albigensian perfect. Even though the teachings of the Albigensians were false and open to refutation by Catholic preachers on an intellectual and theological level, the lives of the Albigensians lent their preaching what we might call a certain authenticity, or at least the appearance of authenticity. By this I mean that there was a kind of authority to their words, an authority lent by the fact that they practiced what they preached. So Diego and Dominic quickly realised that the Cistercians weren't successful because they weren't, in a sense, perceived as authentic. When the Cistercians turned to Diego for advice, the answer was that they should adopt poverty, send their retinues and carriages and horses home, and preach on foot as poor men, as Jesus and the apostles had once done. Here again is a feature of Dominican spirituality, a feature that pertains to the form or style of our preaching. The whole life of the preacher has to be attractive, has to be authentic, if his message was really to be heard. People listened to the Albigensians because of the impressive lives they lived. Now, if Catholic preachers were to lead similar lives, their message might well gain a hearing too. And so this black cloak or capa that Dominicans wear gives us the nickname in medieval England of Blackfriars. Well, this was the same as the cloak, really, worn by the Albigensian perfect. Not that poverty was merely some kind of means to get people to listen, you know, a kind of a ladder that you can kick down once you've got up where you intend to be. Well, to Dominic, poverty, living by begging, was something much more fundamental to the preaching of the gospel. And to understand this, we have to see the Dominicans and the Albigensians as part of the religious culture of their time. And this culture was one that sought to follow the apostolic way of life, the very same way of life that Jesus and his disciples had led as they wandered around Galilee preaching the good news of the kingdom of heaven, or the manner of life led by the earliest church, in which all things were held in common, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles. Well, as the economic, political and urban culture of Europe developed, so the desire for apostolic simplicity refused to go away. We can see this in so many groups, some proving heretical, others proving themselves to be at the very heart of orthodoxy. Another orthodox example would be St. Francis and his brothers, following Christ the poor man, and seeking a radical poverty in which nothing at all was owned, either privately or in common, even one's friary, where one lived, being the property of another. And Dominic, too, was part of this kind of movement. And although the aspirations of succeeding generations may have been different, Dominicans are, in an important sense, heir to a spiritual manner of life that is meant to form an authentic preacher. Dominic was okay with corporate ownership and had no problem with Dominican communities owning their own priory and their church. What he rejected was the ownership of property which brought income to the friars through rents. At first, tithes were given by the diocese to the community in Toulouse, but in 1217, Dominic renounced this privilege. In 1219, he tore up the title deed to a valuable property in Bologna. Dominic saw the value in the vulnerability of this way of life, a vulnerability which formed the preacher for his task. But at the same time, it wasn't something entirely unrealistic. The attraction of the apostolic way of life meant that ordinary people would support those who undertook it, just as many people had supported the Albigensian perfect, though they were unwilling to live that manner of life themselves, but they'd support it. So though there were days when no one would give any alms, days when Dominic would work a miracle and angels would come in and arrive with loaves of bread, well, people would support the brothers in this way of life, and they were happy to receive the benefit of their preaching and their prayers. Things changed with the Black Death. The economic situation could no longer support the Dominican way of life, as Dominic had envisaged it in all of its detail, and the order was required by the Pope to support itself by rents as well as by gifts. And today the manner of life we lead is still understood to be the kind of life that should form an authentic preacher. Our goods are held in common, and a large proportion of our income is still from gifts or from interest earned on invested gifts. So we're still asking people for money, just in case you wondered. So, Dominican preaching is also then characterised by the fact that it's lived out of a certain pattern of life, our spirituality. If an order of wandering mendicant preachers was a novel idea, many of the elements that made up their life were not novel. Dominic had already lived a community life as an Augustinian canon, and it was such community life with appropriate changes that he brought with him into his new order. As I've said, the time of the order's foundation was a time of great religious renewal, and people had been founding new orders and drawing up new religious rules left, right and centre. In the end, the church had to call a bit of a halt to something that seemed to be getting out of control, and the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, just before the founding of the Dominicans, said that new orders had to adopt already existing rules. The Dominicans adopted the rule that Dominic had already lived, the rule of St. Augustine. In one way, this was pragmatic. It was the shortest and vaguest of all the rules. The brothers could then append their own more specific constitutions, which could change as need arose. But they were also aware that they were adopting the rule of a great preacher. And I'll just note one thing in this that seems to me to be important for the character of our preaching. The rule, reflecting on the Apostolic Church in Acts, calls on the community to be of one heart and one mind. The Dominican constitutions are revolutionary because they invite us to seek one heart and one mind in the order by way of a certain participative government, or you might call it democracy. How we listen to one another is an important part of our spirituality that forms the Dominican preacher. But because Father Timothy Radcliffe is going to speak about this next week, I'm not going to say anything more about it. But of course, the life of a Dominican community is centred ultimately around its common prayer, its orientation on God, who is the focus of Dominican religious life in a way that the people we preach to are not. I should add that Dominican life is particularly characterised by the connection between prayer and study. Studying is, of course, a very difficult thing to do and keep at. And this says something about the particular asceticism that is involved in Dominican spirituality. It's the hard work of study combined with a life of prayer. And this difficult and prayerful study both brings you deeper into the knowledge of God, and it also gives you something to say when you preach. When Dominic first got his preachers together, he wanted them to be educated preachers, so he found someone, an Englishman in fact, to lead their studies. And very soon the order was at Paris and Bologna and then in Oxford. When the Franciscans first came to England, their first community was in Canterbury, then London, and only then in Oxford. The Dominicans, however, settled down nowhere until they reached Oxford, which they did in 1221, around the time of Dominic's death. Now, university cities were great places to find people to join the order, but they were also great places for equipping friars for the work of preaching, not only by the study of theology, but by the study of all truth that could assist the mission of the order. Again, it's the universality of truth. Dominicans studied the scriptures, but not only that. St. Albert the Great became the greatest natural scientist of his day, and his pupil, St. Thomas Aquinas, absorbed the new learning that was being introduced into the West, pagan wisdom from classical times, and Muslim and Jewish philosophy from nearer his own day, trying to understand where it was coming from, seeing how far it contained truth, and how far it was in need of perfection through the sacred teaching of Scripture. But Thomas Aquinas in his theology, much of which was commentary on the Bible, always had preaching close to his mind. His famous Summa Theologiae was written for the training of Dominican preachers in theology, against the background of what Thomas saw as the inadequate preparations available. Now, Dominicans were okay for practical preaching advice. The fifth master of the order, Humbert of Romans, around the same time, wrote a work on preaching, identifying the nature of the task and so on. He saw it as an office in the church, the preacher called by the church. It was an exalted office because it was prompted by the Holy Spirit. It's for the salvation of souls, because the ability to preach effectively and humbly can only be given by the grace of God, because our words falter before such mysteries, or the words used in preaching, they're more likely to fail than words involved in any other human talking. For this reason, the preacher needs prayer, study, and a manner of life not at odds with the message he preaches. Sermons, Humbert says, need to be preached in a strong, clear voice. They must be simple, but not too simple, using examples and argument and proper authorities. Not preaching about yourself, and not preaching at the wrong moment or in the wrong place. The congregation must never get humiliated, he says. You should listen and learn from other people's sermons. You should know what you can do with language. You should be amiable and humble, respectful of local customs. And don't get discouraged, he says, if people don't congratulate you on your preaching. Be balanced in your talk outside of sermons, all that kind of thing. Well, St. Thomas's concern is more with the other side of preaching, the pastoral situations that come afterwards. Having preached a sermon, naturally people would be moved to repentance and they'd want to go to confession. There were all plenty of manuals advising Dominicans and other priests how to deal with such pastoral encounters, telling you all about the different kinds of sin, penances, the vices, and all that kind of thing. What Thomas seems to have been doing in the Summa Theologiae is to see the connection between the moral and the pastoral and the doctrinal, seeing it all as a unity. The preacher educated by the Summa would then be able to see their pastoral work and the moral life it concerned in the light of and intimate connection with the teachings of the church found in the Bible and summarized in the creeds. For Thomas, this was the only adequate way to prepare a preacher for the full task of his work, equipping him with a unified view of what he's about. Like Dominic's attempt to preach Albigensian out of existence, well, it wasn't a brilliant success. If you look at the copies of the medieval Summa, people just take the bits out they're interested in and don't look at the whole context. Well, I said earlier that there are many different perspectives, well, I think I said this, from which we can view the teaching of the gospel, and this is a Dominican way to do it. I want to draw things to a close by saying something about this Dominican view, well, St. Thomas's view of theology, and how, as well as preparing one for preaching, it has a view of where the Dominican fits into this whole wider picture that St. Thomas is looking at. Thomas's perspective on theology is just God. Theology could be thought to be about all sorts of things, but Thomas's angle is God. It's about God. And everything else insofar as it's related to God. Creatures are related to God in two ways, coming from him as from their origin and somehow returning to him as their goal. Different kinds of creatures return to God by flourishing in their own particular ways according to the different kind of natures they possess. Human beings are intellectual beings, and we flourish partly, but principally, by coming to know the truth, ultimately by coming to know God, who is truth. God is, of course, perfect, so flourishes perfectly just by knowing himself with complete perfection. What grace is all about is human beings not just flourishing in a human way, but flourishing also in a kind of divine way, by getting a share in God's own knowledge of himself. In other words, people begin in a very distant way to see things somehow as God sees them, related to God. And this knowledge starts in the darkness of faith and ends in the light of the vision of God in heaven. This life is a journey of faith to the goal of seeing. In faith and then in vision, God is sharing his knowledge with us, and so makes us flourish, makes us happy. The centre of all this is Christ, the truth made flesh. The truth and life become the way for us to make our way back to God, from whom we came. Among other things, Christ is our teacher, and it's in him that we believe. Well, the preacher has a role here, because the preacher first learns this truth from Christ through the scriptures, through the church, and then passes on what he's learnt to others by preaching. In one place, Thomas considers the different ways in which Christians can live. Thomas notes how some people just are more practical types, and others are more kind of theoretical types in the way that they live. And in the church, there is the contemplative calling, the call to contemplate truth, and the active calling, which contains many different kinds of activity, but one of them is preaching, handing on the truth to others. Thomas asks which is best, action or contemplation, and it's pretty obvious which it is. It is contemplation of the truth, which is God, that makes us truly successful human beings, sharing in God's knowledge forever in heaven. But Thomas doesn't think that that's on its own just the best kind of Christian life. It's not purely contemplative. As he puts it, it's better to illumine than just to shine. In other words, it's better to let your contemplation of truth, by prayerful study and eager prayer, to let that contemplation be shared with other people. So the best life for Thomas is one that mixes contemplation and preaching of some kind. Unsurprisingly, maybe, Thomas hints very strongly that the Dominican way of life is best. But I suppose he would say that. Anyway, what is so striking for me about Thomas's theology is how the business of contemplation and preaching is set so securely within his overall scheme of seeing all things as related to God, coming from God and going back to him, with coming to know God as the way back to him, and contemplation and sharing the fruits of one's contemplation as embedded in this movement, which is the story of all creation. So, for Thomas, preaching could not be a nobler or more fruitful thing. There couldn't be a more noble or fruitful thing to which to devote one's life. And it's this preaching that's at the heart of Dominican spirituality, because that's how we Dominicans are hoping to make our return to God. I think that's about all I've got time for, because we want to have questions, don't we?
Well, we've been treated to the most incredible, lucid and comprehensive talk about not only preaching, but about the Dominican way of thinking, a way of life, yes. I wonder if anybody would like to ask a question. Have you got a big voice? Have you got a? Can you project your voice?
I can be heard.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Yes.
It should be. This is a very basic question and rather personal. You're a Dominican. Did you first of all want to be a monk, or did you come across the Dominican way of life, or were you always a Catholic? How, if you want to be a monk, do you decide which order you're going to join?
I wasn't always a Catholic. I became a Catholic when I was at the university in Oxford, when I was about 21. But I thought about vocation before that, and I remember when I was about 14, I read somewhere that the Dominicans were the first religious order to give up manual labour and replace it with reading books. And I thought, well, that sounds like the kind of thing. But that was just reading something in a book. And I suppose I did visit Oxford once when I was 16 and did a bit of a tour around. And I went by Blackfriars and I looked and I thought, oh, maybe if I were a Catholic and wanted to join, be a monk, I thought, maybe this is a monastery I'd like to join, because I didn't realise about Dominicans being all over the world and everything. I just thought, I was about 16. And then I suppose later on, then, when I became a Catholic, you make your first confession. So, I was doing that for however, nearly 20 years of sinning. And then I remember that the priest said to me at the end, if you're thinking about vocation, I don't know if you are, but if you are, you're not to do anything about it for another 2 or 3 years or something, I don't remember. But anyway, during that time, I did get to know different religious orders, because Oxford, there's quite a diversity of Catholic life. So I did get to know different orders very well. And I think the thing about the Dominicans were they did 2 things I liked, which was academic work, and they also did pastoral work with people. So I thought, well, there seems to be these 2 things going on there, and I feel the 2 things are going on in me. And I think that's what drew me to choose to apply to the Dominicans. It's not necessarily why I've stayed. I think, once you get into it and you think about it, then it's because of preaching, communicating the truth, that you want to stay. But I think why I was attracted to it was because they did work with people and they did work with books. So,
Yes.
You gave a very harmonious sort of picture of the search for truth, but it seems to me that you've assumed from the beginning there is a truth, and you're going to discover it. That's going to be wonderful. And yet, most people don't approach it that way. They think, I look for truth and I'm not sure where it will lead me. So that was very striking.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's something that's especially characteristic of the contemporary or the modern world. And I think one way in which we try to respond to that is by people actually being concerned more with the whole notion of truth. And whether there is such a thing as truth, which you have to talk about if you're going to ask what the truth is. You have some kind of notion of that. So Dominicans, I suppose, are not simply interested in theology, but also quite interested in philosophy as well, because I think we'd see if there is, if our preaching, what we want to do, can make any sense at all, there has to be a context in which people can ask the questions about truth. And those are really philosophical questions to which, you don't really open the Bible and it answers those kind of questions. So I think we find Dominicans involved as much really in philosophy as in theology, and there are people who are concerned with those kinds of things because they're very much the kind of things that what you said is what people do say to you. So yeah, certainly I gave a very harmonious and oversimplified presentation of things, but you've put your finger on something very important.
Yes, I was very struck by your remarks about the link between preaching and compassion. And it's very easy to see that in action, I think, in the contemporary period. But since you brought up the historical referent, I'm just a bit worried about thinking back at examples in history of evangelization going along with coercion and violence rather than compassion. And of course the fate of the Cathars, the Crusades and so on. So I'm just wondering how those 2 things are reconciled in that founding period.
Yeah, I think they're There's a kind of
Question.
Okay, shall I explain about it? Talking about compassion and truth and preaching, but of course in the history of preaching and evangelization, there are moments when it seems that there isn't compassion evident, examples being things like the Crusades. I mean, well, starting with the Albigensians, of course, St. Dominic didn't bring an end to Albigensianism by his preaching. An end was brought to it by a crusade from northern France to southern France, and the killing of Albigensians. That's really how that ended. And then also coercion and things in, say, in the bringing of Christianity to America, and people not being presented with the Christian faith in the right way. This is something that at the time Dominicans were complaining about and writing about and trying to get representation, say, in Spain, to bring these things to people's attention. Because, as one of the Dominicans at the time said, the preaching of the gospel should be accompanied by signs and wonders. It is actually being accompanied by injustices and so on. So there's something that Dominicans do come to realise when there's evangelization in new lands, and something that they do want to address and preach in the right kind of way. But of course you're right to say that there are failures, and there have been failures in Dominican ways to preach as well, and we can look back at our history and find things that we're proud of and find things that we're not proud of. And I think in the way that I've said, we try to engage with people we don't agree with, but try to engage with them in a positive way. And as Father Timothy will talk about next week, how we do that among ourselves. Sometimes I think we have to do that with our history too. And we have to look at our history and say, what are the things here that we can agree with, and really what are the things that we want to say that this was not the right way and we don't want to repeat.
Dominicans are sometimes associated with the Inquisition.
Mm-hmm. That would be another example, yeah.
And could you elaborate on that?
Okay. I think what I just said here is where I'd come eventually to answer that question. But there are a number of things that get said about this in looking at the past. One of the things is historical work that obviously says, well, the Inquisition isn't as bad as it was made out to be. And one thing there, I suppose, would be that, in some ways, it was much better than the kind of justice or punishments that you might get at the time generally. And that people would prefer to be under the Inquisition than under some kind of secular jurisdiction. So I suppose that's one thing you say, it wasn't as bad as people make out. But of course, that doesn't mean that it was an entirely good thing. So there are ways to look at that. But also, I think, as I say, applying the kind of method that I was saying then, that we would do with anyone that we talked to or disagreed with, or when we have disagreements about ourselves, which is the kind of dialogue that we look for. And I think to try and look back on things like our involvement in the Inquisition, I think we tried to look for what we were trying to do that was good from the point of view of the value of truth and so on. And then we would also want to see where we disagree with these Dominicans from that time. So I think we would approach that in the same spirit that we would approach anything or anyone where we have disagreements, and how we would do that among ourselves today where we disagree.
Yeah, because I'm Spanish, and I was quite ashamed actually when I traveled in South America. We used the term.
Yeah.
And of course, every time that you say in Spanish, Inquisition. It's something that
Yeah, it's quite difficult because often
you have to carry on.
Well, that's right. People do often. At the same time, people often think things happened that didn't happen, and they often think that they were much better at their job than they were. Often these inquisitors weren't doing all the things that they were supposed to be doing anyway. So, but at the well, you see, this is another thing about burning books, is that now not talking about the Spanish Inquisition, but talking about Dominic's own day. For example, Dominic, I said this thing about where the two sides threw their books into the fire, and Dominic's very well. There's a book as I saw on sale in Blackwell's, where it has a painting of this on the front, and then it says, "This is St. Dominic burning people's books," which is not what he was doing. It's actually where both sides threw their books in. But you see, people do think St. Dominic went around burning people's books, if they read that cover. So there are examples where what people are saying isn't the truth about these things. But at the end but there are things that, so the Dominican thing would be what really is the truth about this, and then dealing not with myths about the Inquisition, but to deal with the reality and see, what we think about the reality of it. And a lot of work historical work has gone on in recent years about the Inquisition, and the way it's seen isn't quite the same now as the way it might have been seen, or the way it might be seen on a kind of a popular level.
There's a gentleman right at the back there.
Just thank you very much, Father, for your talk. We enjoyed so much.
Thank you.
2 questions. First, just a personal question. How do you, as an academic living in Oxford, avoid living in an ivory tower? And secondly, for maybe some people know what it is like now.
Yeah, I didn't hear that. I heard you say Vincent McNabb, but I didn't hear what you said. Yeah, what did you say about him?
No, just saying the book that was written about his life as Saint Hyde Park Corner.
Oh, yeah.
And it's very interesting in that book to see the combination between his desire to preach and the practical work that he also did in the parish and so on. So how do you avoid living in an ivory tower?
How do I... Oh, gosh, well, first of all, it's not something that I've given any thought to, because I didn't think I was in one in the first place, if you see what I mean. I suppose how you are not going into an ivory tower is the fact that you remain in contact with other people and that they shape your life, and that your life is as well shaped by similar things that shape that of other people. So I don't think we're in any way immune to what goes on in the world, or in the lives of our families and the families of each other. So it's not really that I've felt there's a problem that I've got to avoid, because I don't think I've ever really been in one, because I don't think you can escape from reality for too long anyway.
I'd like to ask something, which is, when you were talking about flourishing, you contrasted the contemplative life with action, and obviously for Dominicans, preaching is that action, but for the rest of us who perhaps don't spend our lives preaching, what could be the corollary to contemplative prayer, contemplation, in order to...
Well, I suppose, I think I've probably made this not work. Really, any kind of action that pertains to the Christian life, acts of charity and acts of caring for your neighbour and so on, it's all those things that come under action. Visiting the sick, supporting people who are caring for the sick. You can, some people go and visit people in prison, and all sorts of different ways. But simply caring for the people that one meets in life. And these are all ways in which Christian action takes place. I don't think anyone can lead any life that doesn't have some element of that in this life. And of course, no one can do it without some element of contemplation. Prayer is what supports the whole of the things that we do. So, all those things would come into our own life as well. I think it's just how you think about your life and whether there's one thing that's your focus, and preaching is obviously ours, and there are lots of different ways that you can focus your Christian life. And we want to support everyone else's Christian life as well as living our own, obviously.
This must be the last one, I'm afraid.
And when I think about the spread of monasticism in Britain, I think of the great monastic foundations, Cistercian and Mendicant. I can't think of one Dominican set up like that.
Okay.
I only know the ones in Oxford because I'm local.
Right.
Why
Shall I tell you about some? Well, have you heard of Blackfriars Bridge in London?
Yes.
Well, there's a massive Blackfriars there, just where the River Fleet come. Well, today you can just see this little bit of water trickling out into the Thames. But there was a river there, and Blackfriars was a large priory there. So we generally were in most towns, we tended in medieval times to be on the east side of the country. And I think a lot of that was to do with the economic realities of trade and so on. We tended to go for cities, whereas Cistercians would want to be in the kind of big place in the countryside. We would often go for places within cities, so we were in easy contact with people for the work of preaching. Often that means, you know, if you have a Cistercian monastery, it then gets ruined. It's out in the countryside, you see the ruins. Where we were within towns, things would be quickly reused, and so the places disappear. But most big towns that you go to, you might see Blackfriars as a place name still. If in terms of seeing, if you went to Canterbury, the King's School Art Department is our refectory where we used to eat. You can see the pulpit where one of the friars read from while everyone else was eating. And then there's a youth club on the other side of the river there in Canterbury, and that's part of our buildings as well. And if you were to go to Newcastle, it's sort of kind of a shopping centre or something. And others became, maybe schools were founded, for example, in Brecon in Wales, their Christ College became a school in the 16th century, and that was using Dominican priory there. And often if you go, you know, if you're in Edinburgh or somewhere, you might see Blackfriars. Now in Oxford, if you went down to the river, you'll see Preacher's Lane and Blackfriars Road. There was a Friars Wharf. They're indications of where we were. If you go into the Oxford Centre for the Hard of Hearing, then you go down St Ed Street. You'll see in the Centre for the Hard of Hearing 2 archways, and those would be part of the entrance to our priory. That's all that's left of the second priory. Another reason was when they were destroyed, they really did want to make sure the Dominicans weren't coming back, so they did a really good job of destroying them. So I suppose with Cistercians, then you travel around the country and you can see these things, whereas we were really in the cities, places where the buildings were easily reused or demolished.
Sadly, because I'm sure this could run and run, we must call this to an end. But I really thank you for a fascinating talk, which has answered a lot of questions for me, and I hope for others too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Distinguished Dominican friar, and in fact we've got 6 wonderful speakers, so do keep coming. The other thing is that this is a non-profit making organisation, and we will be very pleased to be able to make a donation to Blackfriars in some way or another before the end of the series. So if you can take the poverty bit seriously, I'd be grateful. Thank you for coming.